It began with a single envelope, thin and unassuming, sitting on the edge of the mailbox like a lurking threat. Inside was a formal notice from the Homeowners Association, printed on their pristine letterhead, embossed with their insignia, and written with the smug authority only an HOA president could muster. The message was blunt. Remove the non-compliant shed in your backyard within 30 days or face escalating fines and potential legal action. The shed in question was hardly a palace. It was a modest, weatherproof structure painted to match the house, tucked neatly against the fence. It stored nothing more than gardening tools, holiday decorations, and the old bicycle that hadn't seen the road in years. There was nothing extravagant about it, certainly nothing worthy of legal warfare. But to the HOA, this was apparently a declaration of war. At first, it seemed like an honest mistake. After all, many homes in the neighborhood had backyard structures, some even larger and far more conspicuous. The assumption was that a quick phone call would clear up the matter, that a polite explanation would resolve the issue. But the HOA president, a sharp-eyed woman named Carol, known for her iron grip on the community's rules, made it clear that this was no misunderstanding. According to her, the shed violated newly revised bylaws, rules conveniently pushed through at the last board meeting, where attendance had been deliberately kept low. The days that followed were filled with tense silence. Neighbors avoided eye contact, pretending they hadn't seen the notice taped to the front door. Some whispered about how Carol had been itching to make an example out of someone, and this shed, so ordinary and unremarkable, had somehow become the perfect target. Perhaps it was because the homeowner wasn't the type to attend HOA meetings or bow to arbitrary authority. Perhaps Carol sensed defiance and decided to crush it before it spread. The 30-day clock ticked down mercilessly. Fines began accumulating, ridiculous amounts added daily for non-compliance. Photos were taken over the fence without permission, documenting the shed from every possible angle. A second notice arrived, more threatening than the first, this time mentioning legal action and the possibility of the HOA seeking a court order for demolition. It was an intimidation tactic, one the HOA had used on other residents before, forcing them to give up rather than endure the stress. But this time was different. The homeowner decided not to back down. Instead of quietly dismantling the shed and pretending nothing happened, they started researching. The HOA's bylaws were requested in full, every amendment scrutinized. Old meeting minutes were tracked down, revealing just how sloppy the board had been in passing their shed rule. There were inconsistencies everywhere, votes improperly counted, quorum requirements ignored, and vague wording that left the bylaw legally questionable. The discovery was both enraging and empowering. What was presented as an airtight case against the shed turned out to be a house of cards built on arrogance and procedural shortcuts. With this knowledge, the decision was made. The shed would stay, and the HOA would have to prove their authority in court if they dared to try and remove it. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Some residents quietly cheered, grateful someone was finally standing up to the HOA. Others feared retaliation, worried that siding with a troublemaker would put them in Carol's crosshairs. The HOA board doubled down, hiring an attorney to draft threatening letters, demanding immediate compliance. Carol paraded through the neighborhood with a self-satisfied smile, confident that legal pressure would force a capitulation. But what Carol didn't know was that the homeowner had also hired legal counsel, a sharp, methodical attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. And unlike the HOA's lawyer, who was being paid out of community funds, this attorney was personally invested in dismantling petty tyrannies like Carol's. Together, they began preparing for a fight, one that would soon grow far bigger than a shed. The first court summons arrived just days before the HOA's 30-day deadline expired. Instead of showing fear, the homeowners showed resolve. They filed counterclaims, alleging harassment, improper rule changes, and misuse of HOA funds to target individual residents. It wasn't just about a shed anymore. It was about holding the entire board accountable for years of unchecked power and selective enforcement of rules. The battle lines were drawn. Carol thought this would be another easy victory, a quick lesson in HOA obedience. But she had underestimated her opponent. What began as a simple notice about a backyard shed was about to spiral into a legal war that would consume the HOA from the inside out. By the time the deadline passed, the shed still stood, untouched and defiant. The HOA's fines ballooned to absurd levels, but they hadn't collected a single cent. Now, both sides were preparing for court, a showdown that would reveal just how far Carol and her allies were willing to go to protect their authority, and just how determined their opponent was to strip that authority away. The neighborhood was watching, divided and anxious. No one yet realized how far-reaching the consequences would be, or that this petty power struggle would soon bankrupt the HOA itself. The first court hearing was scheduled on a gray Thursday morning, in a cramped municipal courtroom that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. It wasn't the kind of venue where anyone expected high drama, but the tension was already thick before the proceedings began. The HOA board, dressed in coordinated suits as if they were attending a corporate retreat, filed in with stiff postures and cold glares. Carol, the HOA president, led the group with her trademark expression of smug certainty, convinced the judge would rubber-stamp their complaint and order the shed removed. The homeowner arrived quietly, carrying a single folder. But what that folder contained would soon flip the entire case upside down. The HOA attorney opened the hearing with rehearsed confidence, presenting photos of the shed as if it were some monstrous violation threatening the very integrity of the neighborhood. They spoke of community standards, aesthetic harmony, and property values under attack. Every sentence dripped with exaggerated outrage, as though a small backyard structure was capable of collapsing the entire subdivision into chaos. Carol sat in the gallery, nodding emphatically with every word, casting glances toward the homeowner as if to say, "See, this is already over." But then it was the defense's turn. Instead of panicking or apologizing, the homeowner's attorney calmly laid out a trail of evidence showing how the HOA had mishandled the bylaw change. Meeting minutes revealed that the vote to ban sheds had been pushed through during an unannounced session, with barely half the board present, far short of the quorum required by the association's own governing documents. Worse, financial records hinted that the HOA had been misusing funds to pursue personal vendettas, paying for legal threats with money collected from every homeowner in the community. What was supposed to be a quick and easy hearing for the HOA suddenly turned into an ambush. The judge listened intently, frowning as inconsistencies piled up. The homeowner's attorney requested discovery, full access to HOA records, budgets, and correspondence. If granted, this would open every secret door the board had tried so hard to keep locked. Carol's confident smile cracked for the first time. The judge didn't make any final rulings that day, but their instructions were clear. Both sides were to prepare for a full trial. Discovery would move forward. Every board email, every invoice, every bank transaction tied to the case would have to be disclosed. The HOA had just stepped onto a battlefield far larger than they ever intended to fight on. As the board exited the courtroom, their faces were tight with anger and panic. They had underestimated their opponent. What they thought would be a quick order to demolish a shed had become the first step in unraveling their own secrets. And the neighborhood was already buzzing with rumors. Word of the courtroom exchange spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once feared the HOA began asking questions. What were these financial irregularities the lawyer hinted at? What was Carol hiding? The HOA tried to tighten its grip, issuing newsletters filled with thinly veiled threats about community loyalty and shared responsibility. But these only fueled suspicion. Residents who had once bowed to Carol's authority began whispering about organizing their own vote to remove her. Meanwhile, the legal fight intensified. The homeowner's attorney submitted formal complaints to the county, requesting audits of the HOA's spending. Boxes of documents arrived during discovery: emails, contracts, receipts. And buried among them was the smoking gun, proof that Carol had authorized thousands of dollars in HOA funds to pay for a private investigator, hired to snoop on specific residents she disliked. The shed case was merely the latest weapon in her personal crusade. The homeowner and their attorney prepared meticulously, building a case not just to save the shed, but to expose Carol and bankrupt the HOA if necessary. Every hour the HOA spent fighting only dug them deeper into legal fees, draining their reserve funds meant for neighborhood maintenance. Landscaping bills went unpaid. Street repairs were delayed. Even the community pool began to fall into disrepair, with cracks appearing in the plaster and the water turning cloudy. Residents grew restless, demanding to know why their HOA fees were vanishing. Carol deflected blame, holding emergency meetings where she painted the homeowner as a dangerous agitator, destroying the community from within. But fewer and fewer people believed her. Attendance at HOA meetings spiked, not to support the board, but to demand answers. Carol tightened her inner circle, leaning on loyal board members and threatening to censure anyone who questioned her decisions. By the time the second court date approached, the HOA's once polished image was in tatters. What had started as an attempt to tear down a simple shed had become a referendum on power, corruption, and personal vendettas. The legal fees mounted, and Carol was too stubborn to admit defeat. She believed that if she won in court, the residents would forget her misdeeds and fall back in line. But the homeowner wasn't looking for a quiet settlement. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice. And they were about to get it. As the sun set the night before trial, the HOA scrambled to prepare, knowing they were walking into a courtroom that now saw them not as noble protectors of neighborhood standards, but as bullies wasting community resources. And the homeowner, calm and steady, organized one last round of evidence. Financial ledgers, fraudulent invoices, and testimony from neighbors who had been bullied before. The shed stood exactly where it had always been, unchanged and unbothered. But now it symbolized something much bigger, the refusal to be intimidated and the beginning of the end for the HOA that tried to wield absolute power. The morning of the trial arrived under a heavy sky, the kind that seemed to promise a storm whether the clouds opened or not. By the time both parties entered the courtroom, the tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. The HOA board appeared polished but strained, their smiles tight and eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. Carol, at the center of it all, wore an expression of forced confidence, but her stiff posture betrayed the unease settling deep in her bones. The homeowner arrived without theatrics, carrying a simple briefcase while their attorney rolled in two full carts stacked with files, binders, and neatly labeled evidence boxes. It was a stark contrast to the HOA's thin folder of documents and rehearsed statements. What the board thought would be a straightforward case had grown into a monster they could no longer control. The proceedings began with the HOA's attorney reiterating their position. The shed violated community bylaws and had to be removed to preserve property values and neighborhood harmony. They presented photographs, copies of the supposed rule change, and inflated estimates of how the shed's presence could harm the subdivision's aesthetic integrity. Carol sat rigid in the front row, nodding emphatically as if willing the judge to see things her way. But then it was the defense's turn. The homeowner's attorney methodically dismantled the HOA's claims, starting with the bylaw itself. Records showed that the vote banning sheds had been held during an improperly called meeting, with no proper notice given to homeowners and without a legal quorum. The amendment was therefore invalid from the start. Every warning letter, every fine, and every threat issued under that rule had no legal standing. The courtroom murmured as copies of HOA emails and financial ledgers appeared on the overhead screen. Evidence revealed that thousands of dollars in HOA funds had been funneled into personal projects, including the hiring of a private investigator to monitor problem homeowners. Residents' dues, money meant for maintaining playgrounds, repairing sidewalks, and keeping the community pool clean, had instead paid for Carol's crusades against anyone who crossed her. The judge listened closely, eyebrows raised as the attorney highlighted invoice after invoice, some signed directly by Carol, authorizing payments that had nothing to do with community improvement. There were receipts for catered dinners disguised as board meetings, travel expenses labeled as outreach, and legal retainers far exceeding what the HOA's modest budget should have been able to afford. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from a former board member who had quietly resigned months earlier. In a sworn statement, they described how Carol had bullied other members into passing rules without discussion, threatening to smear anyone who opposed her. They confirmed that the shed rule had been railroaded through with barely half the board present, in direct violation of the HOA's own charter. As the testimony unfolded, Carol's composure cracked. Her forced smile faded to a grimace, and her carefully arranged stack of papers began to tremble in her hands. The once confident board members beside her looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. The narrative shifted completely. This wasn't about a shed at all. It was about abuse of power, financial mismanagement, and a president who had turned a neighborhood association into her personal fiefdom. By midday, it became clear the judge had little patience for the HOA's antics. The court ordered a full financial audit of the HOA, appointing an independent investigator to review every transaction over the past 3 years. Any funds spent improperly would have to be repaid by those responsible, not by the homeowners as a whole. The judge also granted the defense's motion to dismiss the HOA's complaint about the shed, ruling that the bylaw it relied on was unenforceable. What should have been the HOA's moment of victory turned into a devastating blow. Carol's attempt to demolish one backyard structure had now placed her entire administration under a microscope. Legal fees mounted by the hour. Every attorney appearance drained the HOA's reserves further, and with the trial still in progress, the bill showed no sign of slowing down. Outside the courthouse, word of the day's events spread faster than anyone expected. Neighbors who once feared retaliation began openly criticizing Carol. Homeowners demanded an emergency meeting to remove her from a board. Some even discussed filing a class action lawsuit against the HOA for misusing community funds. The trial stretched late into the afternoon as the defense introduced one final piece of evidence, a letter from the HOA's insurance provider. It stated that their liability policy would not cover any damages resulting from intentional misconduct or fraudulent spending by board members. If Carol and her allies were found guilty of wrongdoing, they would be personally responsible for the HOA's debts. This revelation hit like a thunderclap. Carol's face drained of color. The board members beside her suddenly seemed far less loyal. Whispers rippled through the courtroom gallery as residents and attendants realized the truth. If the HOA went bankrupt, it wouldn't be because of the shed, it would be because of Carol's arrogance. By the end of the day, the judge adjourned the session and scheduled a follow-up hearing to review the preliminary audit findings. The shed would remain standing, untouched, until the court reached a final decision. As everyone filed out of the courtroom, Carol walked stiffly, avoiding eye contact with her neighbors. The homeowner, calm and deliberate, didn't celebrate or gloat. There was no need. The victory was already unfolding, step by step, as the HOA's financial foundation began to crumble. The neighborhood was no longer divided between those who feared the HOA and those who opposed it. Instead, a new unity began to form, one rooted in outrage, determination, and a growing desire to see justice served. The shed had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of accountability. But the fight was far from over. The audit would dig up more secrets, more misuse of funds, and more evidence of corruption than anyone anticipated. And with every revelation, the HOA's path toward financial ruin would accelerate. The independent audit ordered by the court became the turning point no one in the neighborhood could ignore. What began as a routine financial review quickly unraveled into a full-scale investigation of how the HOA had been run under Carol's iron-fisted rule. The auditors combed through 3 years of bank statements, expense reports, and vendor contracts. What they found painted a picture far worse than anyone had imagined. Invoices showed that thousands of dollars had been diverted to personal luxuries masquerading as community improvements. Landscaping fees were inflated by contractors who mysteriously happened to be friends or relatives of board members. HOA credit cards carried charges for restaurants, spa visits, and even a weekend trip to a coastal resort, none of which had anything to do with neighborhood upkeep. Every irregularity pointed back to Carol, whose signature appeared again and again on payments she had no authority to approve. As the evidence mounted, residents who once stayed silent began to speak up. Homeowners remembered mysterious special assessments levied over the years, charges explained vaguely as necessary for repairs that never seemed to materialize. Potholes remained unfilled, playground equipment stayed broken, and the community pool continued to deteriorate. Now, they understood where their money had gone. The anger in the neighborhood was no longer whispered. It was shouted openly at emergency meetings packed wall to wall with furious homeowners. The HOA board tried to contain the backlash. Carol insisted everything was legitimate, claiming the shed case was a distraction orchestrated by a troublemaker. But her words rang hollow as more documents surfaced. Records showed that the legal war against the homeowner wasn't just unnecessary, it was extravagantly expensive. Tens of thousands of dollars have been spent on lawyers, investigators, and even a public relations consultant tasked with protecting the HOA's image. Those funds came directly from the dues of every resident. The court received the audit's preliminary findings, and the judge's response was swift and severe. A temporary freeze was placed on the HOA's accounts to prevent further misuse of funds. The board was prohibited from issuing new fines or collecting fees until the investigation concluded. This decision left the HOA financially paralyzed. With no money coming in, basic services ground to a halt. Trash pickup contracts lapsed. Common areas went unmaintained, and a neighborhood that had once prided itself on immaculate lawns began to show visible signs of neglect. Residents who once feared Carol now turned against her completely. The same people who whispered warnings about retaliation now demanded her immediate resignation. Petitions circulated calling for a vote to dissolve the HOA entirely if necessary. For the first time, Carol looked cornered, her usual air of authority crumbling under the weight of public outrage and legal scrutiny. Meanwhile, the homeowner who started it all remained calm and steady. The shed still stood in its quiet corner of the backyard, untouched and unbothered, while the chaos swirled outside. Their attorney continued building the case for damages, pushing not only to dismiss the HOA's claims, but also to hold individual board members personally liable for the misuse of funds. Behind closed doors, the remaining board members began to fracture. Some sought private legal counsel, fearing personal bankruptcy if the court forced repayment of misappropriated money. Others considered testifying against Carol to save themselves. What had once been a united front in their campaign against a single shed now splintered into self-preservation and panic. The second court hearing revealed just how deep the corruption ran. The auditors testified that nearly half of the HOA's budget over the past 2 years had been misallocated. Illegal assessments, improper fines, and fabricated expenses had drained the association's reserves to almost nothing. If the current trajectory continued, the HOA would not survive another 6 months. The judge issued an ultimatum. The HOA must repay all improperly spent funds and submit to strict financial oversight, or face dissolution by court order. Carol's attempts to argue were drowned out by evidence too overwhelming to deny. Her position as HOA president became untenable. Angry homeowners openly booed her as she left the courthouse, flanked by the few loyal board members who still stood by her. The neighborhood itself was changing. Once manicured streets grew overgrown, fences went unrepaired, and frustration boiled over as residents realized how much money had been wasted on Carol's personal vendettas. Local news outlets began covering the story, portraying it as a classic case of HOA abuse. Cameras filmed residents standing beside cracked sidewalks and broken park benches, pointing fingers at Carol and her failed leadership. For the homeowner at the center of it all, the fight was no longer just about keeping a shed. It had become a mission to hold an abusive HOA accountable and to show neighbors they didn't have to live under fear and manipulation. What was once a petty dispute now carried real consequences. Personal liability for board members, a collapsing HOA budget, and the very real possibility that the association would be forced to shut down entirely. Carol refused to resign, clinging to power even as her allies abandoned her. She called emergency meetings that no one attended, issued newsletters no one read, and left angry voicemails on residents' phones demanding loyalty. But the community had seen too much to ever return to blind obedience. As the final phase of the audit approached, the HOA's legal bills continued to pile up. The association's insurance provider confirmed they would not cover any penalties resulting from fraud or intentional misconduct, leaving Carol and her fellow board members personally exposed. Every passing day brought new pressure, new demands, and new signs that the HOA was collapsing under its own corruption. The shed still stood proudly in the backyard, a silent monument to defiance, as Carol's empire began to crumble. By the time the final audit report was delivered to the court, the HOA was already on life support. The bank accounts were nearly empty, the reserve funds drained, and the unpaid invoices stacked higher than anyone could believe. What should have been a simple association running routine neighborhood maintenance had turned into a hemorrhaging money pit, bleeding out under Carol's reckless leadership. The judge's response was swift and uncompromising. The court ordered the HOA to repay over $100,000 in misused funds, holding board members personally liable for the amount. It was a staggering figure, one that left Carol visibly shaken as she sat in the courtroom hearing the ruling. For years, she had acted as though she was untouchable, wielding fines and threats like weapons. But now, the authority she clung to so tightly was turning into a financial noose around her own neck. Almost overnight, the HOA's carefully constructed facade collapsed. Contractors refused to work without payment. The landscaping company that once kept every blade of grass perfectly trimmed canceled its services. The pool, already in poor condition, was closed indefinitely when the chemical supplier refused delivery. Even the trash collection contract was suspended after several unpaid bills. What had once been a pristine neighborhood began to resemble a neglected subdivision, with overgrown lawns, uncollected garbage bins, and broken streetlights flickering at night. Residents grew angrier by the day. Many of them had paid their HOA dues faithfully for years, trusting that their money was being used for the community's benefit. Now, they discovered that those funds had been squandered on Carol's personal vendettas and indulgences. The story became the talk of the town, then the subject of local news coverage. Cameras rolled as neighbors spoke out about the bullying tactics, the fraudulent fines, and the endless threats they had endured. Carol attempted to spin the narrative, portraying herself as the victim of a malicious smear campaign. But her words fell flat. Former allies turned on her, revealing private conversations and board meeting notes that painted her as manipulative and domineering. Those who had once sat silently during her power plays now scrambled to distance themselves, some even agreeing to testify against her in exchange for leniency. The homeowner who had refused to tear down their shed remained remarkably calm through it all. Their attorney moved forward with civil claims, seeking damages for harassment, emotional distress, and the illegal fines levied against them. They argued that the HOA's misuse of funds had caused not just personal harm, but harm to every resident forced to live under Carol's rule. The legal fees continued to spiral out of control. Every hour spent fighting in court cost the HOA more money it didn't have, with the insurance company refusing to cover any of the penalties. Carol and the remaining board members were now personally responsible for the association's mounting debts. Foreclosure on personal property became a real possibility for them, a consequence they had never imagined when they first set out to tear down a simple backyard shed. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself began organizing against the HOA. Homeowners gathered signatures to force Carol's resignation and to call for new elections. But even those efforts felt almost meaningless. The HOA as an institution was so financially crippled that it might not survive long enough to hold another vote. Residents openly discussed dissolving the HOA entirely, freeing themselves from the stranglehold of petty rules and power-hungry leadership. The turning point came when the auditors revealed one final piece of damning evidence: a hidden bank account maintained by Carol and a close associate, where HOA funds had been diverted without the knowledge of other board members. This discovery was not just unethical, it was criminal. The court referred the matter to local law enforcement for further investigation. Carol now faced not only civil liability, but the threat of criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. The courtroom atmosphere during the next hearing was electric. The judge openly rebuked the HOA for its behavior, declaring its actions an egregious abuse of power and a betrayal of community trust. The shed case was formally dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be brought back to court. More importantly, the judge granted the homeowner's motion for restitution, ordering the HOA to pay damages directly to the wronged homeowner, a sum so large it would finish draining the association's funds. As Carol left the courthouse that day, her once defiant posture had completely collapsed. Her head hung low as reporters shouted questions she refused to answer. Neighbors who had once feared her now glared openly, no longer intimidated. The reign of the HOA president who thought she was untouchable was finally crumbling before everyone's eyes. In the weeks that followed, the association defaulted on nearly all of its obligations. Without money to pay its debts, the HOA effectively ceased to function. Utility bills went unpaid, common areas fell into deeper disrepair, and even the HOA's legal counsel withdrew when their invoices were ignored. The very organization that had once terrorized residents with threats and fines was now powerless, paralyzed, and bankrupt. And through it all, the shed stood quietly, weathering the seasons without incident. What Carol had tried to portray as a dangerous eyesore had instead become a symbol of resistance and justice. But the final chapter of this saga had yet to be written. The court had scheduled one last hearing to determine whether the HOA would be forcibly dissolved and whether Carol herself would face criminal prosecution. The community, once divided and fearful, now stood united, ready to watch the empire of their former HOA president collapse completely. By the time the trial concluded, the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Months of hearings, depositions, and testimonies had pulled every detail of the HOA's conduct into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The judge's verdict was swift and devastating. Not only had the HOA acted outside the bounds of its own charter by targeting the shed, but it had done so maliciously, weaponizing fines and threats in an effort to intimidate a homeowner into submission. The court ordered the HOA to pay restitution, cover all legal fees, and pay damages for harassment. The amount was staggering, far beyond anything the HOA's dwindling reserves could handle. News of the verdict spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents who had once stayed silent out of fear now openly celebrated. The HOA board, once smug and untouchable, faced angry crowds demanding answers. The president of the HOA, who had spearheaded the campaign against the shed, suddenly found herself cornered by her own neighbors, forced to explain how she had squandered community funds on a vendetta no one had supported. Within days, board members began resigning in disgrace, unable to withstand the backlash or the mounting legal pressure. The financial toll was immediate. Insurance wouldn't cover deliberate misconduct, and with no reserves to draw from, the HOA had no choice but to levy emergency assessments against the very residents they'd been elected to serve. Homeowners refused to pay, organizing petitions to dissolve the board entirely. The once pristine streets, patrolled by an HOA obsessed with uniformity, now echoed with voices demanding accountability. The same neighbors who had once been bullied over mailbox colors and lawn heights now stood together in defiance. Foreclosure notices soon followed as the HOA struggled to satisfy the judgment. The neighborhood clubhouse, a monument to the board's vanity, was sold at auction to pay part of the debt. Vehicles used for HOA patrols were repossessed. By mid-year, the HOA had officially declared bankruptcy, unable to recover from the crushing financial burden. The very organization that had tried to demolish a simple backyard shed no longer existed, its authority reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among other associations in nearby towns. Meanwhile, the shed at the center of the storm still stood, untouched and more symbolic than ever. What had begun as a modest personal project became a landmark of resistance. Neighbors visited often, bringing food and offering thanks to the homeowner who had stood firm against tyranny. What had once been a lonely fight became a community victory, proving that one person's determination could topple even the most entrenched power structures. The former HOA president tried to save face by blaming others on the board, but the damage was done. Lawsuits filed by residents against her personally loomed on the horizon, and whispers circulated that she would be forced to sell her own home to cover personal legal costs. The arrogance that had fueled her crusade against the shed now left her isolated and disgraced. Even those who once sat beside her on the board refused to take her calls. In the months following the HOA's collapse, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. Without endless fines and threats, residents began improving their homes freely. Colorful gardens replaced sterile lawns, porches filled with laughter, and long-forgotten block parties returned. What the HOA had claimed would ruin property values, individuality, instead brought the community closer together. Property prices even rose as word spread that this was a neighborhood free from oppressive oversight. The homeowner, once exhausted by the ordeal, finally found peace. The settlement money paid off legal bills with enough left over to renovate the shed into a fully equipped workshop, a place to create, build, and share with neighbors. He never gloated publicly, but those who knew him well understood that his quiet satisfaction ran deep. What he had defended wasn't just his property, but the principle that no one should be bullied in their own home. The HOA that had once wielded unchecked power no longer existed, its bank accounts empty and its reputation permanently destroyed. Where there had once been fear, there was now freedom. And at the heart of it all stood a small backyard shed, proof that sometimes standing your ground doesn't just protect your own rights. It can inspire an entire community to do the same. The fight had been long, bitter, and exhausting, but the outcome was undeniable. A petty dispute escalated into a war, and in trying to crush one man's will, the HOA had ultimately crushed itself. The neighborhood learned a lesson that would be passed down for years. Power without accountability is fragile, and even the mightiest association can fall when its leaders forget whom they serve. As autumn leaves began to fall and the air grew crisp, the homeowner looked out at his backyard with quiet pride. The shed, once the target of threats, legal notices, and bulldozers, now stood as a monument to resilience. And somewhere in the scattered records of a bankrupt HOA, there was an expensive reminder of what happens when greed and arrogance outweigh simple decency. 2.